The Rise and Fall of the Soviet Union. A chronicle of power, change, and legacy. The story of the Soviet Union begins amidst the turmoil of the early 20th century, a time when the world was caught in the throes of war, revolution, and radical change. In 1917, the Russian Empire, one of the oldest and largest monarchies in the world, collapsed under the pressure of World War I, economic hardship, and social unrest. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, was swept away in the February Revolution, and a provisional government took its place. However, this new government was weak and unable to address the demands of the Russian people for peace, land, and bread. By October of that same year, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalized on this discontent. They launched the October Revolution, a coup against the provisional government, promising to create a government of the working class. The Bolsheviks seized power, storming the Winter Palace in Petrograd, and quickly moved to consolidate their control. They withdrew from World War I, signing a controversial peace treaty with Germany, and began implementing radical socialist policies, nationalizing land, banks, and industries. The formation of the Soviet Union, however, did not come without conflict. After the Bolsheviks took power, a brutal civil war erupted between the Red Army Bolsheviks and the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and moderate socialists. For 3 years, from 1918 to 1921, Russia was engulfed in bloodshed. Millions died from fighting, famine, and disease. Ultimately, the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, prevailed. And in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR) was officially established, uniting Russia and several other former territories of the Russian Empire under a single communist government. The rise of a superpower? Lenin to Stalin. The early years of the Soviet Union were marked by severe hardship and upheaval. Lenin, who became the first leader of the new Soviet state, introduced the new economic policy NEP in 1921, a temporary retreat from full socialism that allowed for some private enterprise and market mechanisms to revive the shattered economy. The NEP helped to stabilize the economy and gained popular support, but Lenin's health began to fail. And by 1924, he died, leaving a power vacuum. A fierce struggle for succession erupted within the Communist Party. On one side was Leon Trotsky, a charismatic revolutionary leader and architect of the Red Army, who argued for rapid industrialization and the spread of communism worldwide. On the other side was Joseph Stalin, a shrewd and ruthless politician who advocated for socialism in one country, focusing on consolidating power within the Soviet Union rather than pursuing global revolution. By the late 1920s, Stalin emerged victorious, having outmaneuvered his rivals through political cunning, manipulation, and brutal repression. Stalin's rise marked the beginning of a new era for the Soviet Union, one of industrialization, collectivization, and terror, determined to transform the Soviet Union into a global superpower. Stalin launched the first of his 5-year plans in 1928. These plans aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy by focusing on heavy industry, steel, coal, and machinery at the expense of consumer goods. Simultaneously, Stalin enforced the collectivization of agriculture, merging millions of small farms into large state-run enterprises. The peasants resisted, leading to mass deportations, widespread famine, and millions of deaths, particularly in Ukraine, in what is now known as the Holodomor. Despite the immense human cost, Stalin's policies achieved rapid industrial growth, transforming the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become the world's second-largest industrial nation, a status reinforced by its growing military might. However, this growth came at a horrifying price. Stalin's regime was marked by political purges, mass executions, forced labor camps, the Gulag, and widespread surveillance. The Great Purge of the late 1930s saw millions of people from high-ranking officials to ordinary citizens accused of treason, arrested, and often executed or sent to the Gulag. World War II and the Soviet Union's emergence as a superpower. The Soviet Union's rise to superpower status was cemented by its role in World War II. Initially, in 1939, Stalin shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. However, in June 1941, Germany broke the pact and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, launching the largest and bloodiest front of the war. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the Nazi war machine, suffering immense losses. The Battle of Stalingrad 1942-1943 became a turning point in the war, where Soviet forces encircled and defeated the German Sixth Army. The Red Army, slowly but steadily, began pushing the Nazis back across Eastern Europe, eventually capturing Berlin in May 1945. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had lost an estimated 27 million people, including both civilians and military personnel, but it had emerged as one of the two dominant military powers in the world, alongside the United States. The Cold War: expansion, competition, and stagnation. The end of World War II marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry and ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets established a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments loyal to Moscow in countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe, dividing East from West, communism from capitalism. The Soviet Union's influence extended far beyond Europe. In Asia, it supported communist movements in China, Korea, and Vietnam. While in Africa and Latin America, it backed socialist and anti-colonial struggles. The Cold War was marked by a nuclear arms race, espionage, proxy wars, and the space race, a symbolic and technological competition that culminated in the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, in 1957. But beneath this facade of power, the Soviet Union was grappling with significant internal challenges. The economy, which was heavily centralized and planned, struggled to innovate and keep up with the technological advances of the West. The rigid political system stifled dissent and discouraged creativity, leading to a society marked by corruption, inefficiencies, and stagnation. Under leaders like Nikita Khrushchev, who denounced Stalin's excesses in his famous secret speech of 1956, and later Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union maintained its global posture, but was increasingly bogged down by bureaucratic inertia and a faltering economy. By the 1980s, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 became a quagmire, sapping resources and morale. The state-run economy was in crisis, plagued by shortages, a lack of consumer goods, and falling productivity. Discontent simmered among various nationalities within the USSR, from the Baltic states to Central Asia, who chafed under Russian dominance and sought greater autonomy. The Gorbachev era and the unraveling of the Soviet Union. In 1985, a new, younger leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. Realizing that the Soviet Union was on an unsustainable path, Gorbachev sought to reform it through a series of sweeping changes. He introduced glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring, policies aimed at increasing transparency in government and introducing market mechanisms into the socialist economy. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech, leading to a surge in public debate and criticism of the government. Long-suppressed national, ethnic, and political grievances surfaced, while perestroika aimed to decentralize economic control and reduce state planning. However, the reforms led to unintended consequences: economic disarray, political chaos, and a loss of control by the central government. The once tightly controlled Soviet society began to fracture. By the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc countries, emboldened by Gorbachev's reforms, began to push for greater independence. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept across Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell, and communist regimes collapsed one after another. Gorbachev chose not to use military force to maintain control, a decision that marked a dramatic departure from previous Soviet policy. Back in the Soviet Union, nationalist movements gained momentum. In the Baltic states, Georgia, Ukraine, and other republics, calls for independence grew louder. In August 1991, a group of hardline Communist Party members and military leaders, fearing that the Soviet Union was falling apart, attempted a coup against Gorbachev. But the coup failed within 3 days, largely due to massive popular resistance led by Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The coup's failure was the final blow to the Soviet Union. By December 1991, the Soviet republics declared independence one by one. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, which had once stood as a global superpower, had disintegrated. Gorbachev also sought to ease tensions with the West and end the costly arms race that had drained the Soviet coffers. He met with Western leaders, including U.S. President Ronald Reagan, to negotiate arms reduction treaties. His efforts earned him praise abroad, but at home, many hardliners saw his policies as a dangerous weakening of Soviet power. By the late 1980s, the situation had grown even more volatile. The Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, long kept in line by Soviet military force, began to break free. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept across Eastern Europe. In Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, communist governments fell like dominoes. The Berlin Wall, that potent symbol of the Iron Curtain, was torn down by jubilant crowds. Gorbachev chose not to use force to stop these movements, believing that the cost of repression would be too high and counterproductive. Back in the Soviet Union, the forces of disintegration were gathering momentum. In the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, national independence movements grew stronger. And in 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to declare its independence from the Soviet Union. Other republics soon followed suit. The Soviet central government found itself powerless to stop the tide. In Russia, the largest republic, Boris Yeltsin, a former ally of Gorbachev turned critic, began to champion the cause of Russian sovereignty. Yeltsin was elected as the president of Russia in 1991, directly challenging Gorbachev's authority. As the summer of 1991 arrived, tensions reached a boiling point. On August 19th, a group of hardline Communist Party members and military officers, fearful that Gorbachev's reforms were spiraling out of control, staged a coup to seize power. Tanks rolled into the streets of Moscow, and Gorbachev was put under house arrest in his dacha in Crimea. The coup plotters declared a state of emergency, banned protests, and took over key institutions. But the Soviet people had changed. They had tasted freedom, however limited, under glasnost, and they refused to return to the old ways. Thousands of people flooded the streets of Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. To resist the coup, Boris Yeltsin, standing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament, called for mass resistance. The COO, lacking popular support and clear leadership, crumbled after 3 days. The failed coup was the final blow to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his power was shattered. The republics, emboldened by the coup's failure, accelerated their push for independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a forest outside Minsk. They signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union was dissolved and replaced by the Commonwealth of Independent States (CIS). Gorbachev, realizing he had lost control, resigned on December 25, 1991. The red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, once a superpower and a colossus of the 20th century, was no more. It had collapsed under the weight of its internal contradictions. An inefficient economy, political repression, national discontent, and an inability to reform in a way that preserved its unity. Gorbachev's attempt to save the Soviet Union had instead hastened its end, leaving a legacy of shattered dreams, economic chaos, and a new world order that emerged from its ruins. Yet, for many, the story of the Soviet collapse was also a story of liberation. The peoples of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Ropsy republics were free to determine their own destinies for the first time in decades. But it was a freedom that came with its own challenges, as the world moved into an uncertain future shaped by the ghosts of an empire that had, for so long, seemed unshakable. Consequences of the fall and the legacy in post-Soviet Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union had profound and far-reaching consequences. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Russia, as the largest successor state, faced economic collapse, rampant inflation, and a sharp decline in living standards. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and crime rates surged. The economy went through a painful transition from a centrally planned system to a market-oriented one, a process that was marked by widespread corruption, the rise of oligarchs, and a dramatic increase in social inequality. The Soviet Union's collapse also redrew the geopolitical map of the world. 15 new independent states emerged from the wreckage. From the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the countries of the Caucasus. The United States became the world's sole superpower, and the Cold War era came to an end. But the legacy of the Soviet Union continued to loom large over Russia. The new Russian Federation faced an identity crisis, struggling to reconcile its Soviet past with its aspirations for a democratic and capitalist future. In the 1990s, under President Boris Yeltsin, Russia experienced political turmoil, economic hardship, and social disarray. The country was mired in corruption, and its state institutions were weak. The rise of Vladimir Putin. A return to power instability, or dictatorship. In 1999, a relatively unknown, former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was appointed prime minister by Yeltsin, who resigned on December 31, 1999, handing over the presidency to Putin. Putin quickly moved to consolidate power, presenting himself as a strong leader capable of restoring stability, order, and pride to Russia after the chaotic 1990s. Putin's rise to power marked a significant shift in Russian politics. He centralized authority, curbed the influence of the oligarchs, and brought the media under state control. He reasserted the power of the state, using the security services and a loyal cadre of officials to tighten his grip on power. Under Putin, Russia experienced economic growth, fueled by high oil prices, and many Russians welcomed the return of stability and a sense of national pride. Is increasingly authoritarian. Political opposition has been suppressed, with prominent critics jailed or exiled. Civilizations have faced restrictions, and elections have been widely regarded as unfair. Putin has extended his rule through constitutional changes, raising concerns about a return to dictatorship. Legacy of the Soviet Union in modern Russia. The legacy of the Soviet Union continues to shape Russia in many ways. Putin has often invoked Soviet history to foster a sense of national pride and continuity, while the state promotes a narrative that emphasizes the Soviet Union's role in defeating fascism during World War II and its status as a superpower. Meanwhile, many of the challenges that faced the Soviet Union, economic dependency on natural resources, regional tensions, and authoritarian governance, persist in modern Russia to shape Russia's politics, society, and international relations to this day. While some see Vladimir Putin's rule as a return, the Soviet past also continues to influence Russia's foreign policy. Under Putin, Russia has sought to reassert its influence over the former Soviet republics, leading to tensions and conflicts, such as the war in Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. This has led to a new confrontation with the West, reminiscent of the Cold War era. Conclusion: a nation's journey through power, collapse, and renewal. The Soviet Union rose from the ashes of the Russian Empire to become a global superpower, only to collapse under the weight of its internal contradictions.